Tonight, we uncover a story buried beneath centuries of faith, a rivalry older than any religion, and a secret that may change everything we think we know about divine power. They say the walls of Rome hold every secret, but some are buried far deeper in vaults where candlelight hasn't flickered in generations, where dust settles on truths too dangerous for daylight, and where you, dear listener, are about to tread on ground that historians whisper about only after tenure and several glasses of wine. You're standing now in a corridor beneath the Vatican, somewhere between the Sistine Chapel's foundation and a wine cellar that's seen more popes than most cathedrals, and honestly, you probably won't survive this, at least not without questioning everything you thought you knew about the Knights Templar, their mysterious disappearance, and why 18 ships laden with treasure vanished from La Rochelle harbor on October 13, 1307, the same night King Philip IV of France arrested every Templar he could find, which turned out to be significantly fewer than he'd hoped. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world, because there's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all scattered across time zones, united by our collective insomnia and fascination with medieval maritime mysteries. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, starting with the scent of old parchment that fills your nostrils as you descend another stone step, your fingers trailing along walls that remember when Constantine made Christianity respectable, when the Templars were founded in 1119 to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem, and when Pope Innocent II granted them unprecedented privileges in 1139, making them answerable only to the papacy itself. A mainstream historical fact that gets delightfully complicated when you realize this made them simultaneously the most trusted and most dangerous organization in Christendom. The archive chamber opens before you now, its ceiling lost in shadows that seem to breathe with the accumulated weight of 9 centuries worth of theological debates, financial ledgers, and correspondence between popes and kings who smiled at each other in public, while sharpening their metaphorical knives in private. And you can almost hear the scratch of quills on vellum, the anxious cough of a scribe who's just realized he's copying something he really shouldn't know about, the soft rustle of a cardinal's robes as he checks over his shoulder before sliding a particularly incriminating letter into his sleeve. Your guide, let's call him Brother Matteo, though that's probably not his real name because Vatican archivists are notoriously cagey about their identities, presumably to avoid awkward questions at dinner parties, gestures toward a wooden chest bound in iron, its lock corroded green with age, and he mentions, almost casually, that some historians believe the Templars possessed a piece of the true cross that allegedly wept real tears every Good Friday, which is the kind of quirky historical tidbit that makes you wonder whether medieval relics were just extremely elaborate pranks played on the credulous, or whether faith itself operates on frequencies we've since forgotten how to hear. The chest creaks open. Everything down here creaks, because apparently Double D40 hasn't made it to the Vatican sublevels yet, and inside, wrapped in silk that disintegrates at the mere suggestion of touch, you find a ledger dating to early October 1307, its pages filled with entries in Latin, Old French, and what Brother Matteo identifies as a Templar cipher that scholars still debate about in terms of whether it represents a genuine secret code or just really bad handwriting from monks who'd consumed too much sacramental wine. The entries speak of ships, 18 in total, though some accounts vary between 15 and 22, depending on which manuscript you trust and how much you're willing to overlook obvious copying errors, being loaded at La Rochelle with crates whose contents remain maddeningly vague, treasures of the faith, documents pertaining to the foundation, relics of such power that kingdoms rise and fall upon their keeping, and one entry that simply reads the silver, which feels simultaneously specific and frustratingly ambiguous, like a medieval version of a conspiracy theorist's Reddit post. You can smell the salt air even here, hundreds of miles from any ocean, as if the parchment itself absorbed the maritime atmosphere of that desperate night, when Templar knights, these warrior monks who'd fought Saracens in the Holy Land, managed banking systems across Europe, and built castles that still make modern engineers wonder how they managed the engineering, without PowerPoint presentations, realized that their political protection was evaporating faster than morning dew on a Jerusalem hillside. The mainstream historical record confirms that on Friday, October 13, 1307, King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, though fair referred to his appearance rather than his judicial temperament, which was about as fair as a rigged carnival game, ordered the simultaneous arrest of all Templars in French territory, But what the record doesn't explain is why his soldiers found so few knights at the Paris temple, why the order's treasury was substantially lighter than expected, and why the harbor master at La Rochelle reported, in testimony given under circumstances we'll politely describe as coercive, that he'd seen ships departing in darkness, their lanterns extinguished, their destination unknown. Brother Matteo turns a page carefully, his fingers protected by cotton gloves that seem inadequate for handling this much concentrated history, and you notice that his hands shake slightly, whether from age, caffeine, or the weight of what these documents represent. You can't quite tell, as he points to a marginal note written in different ink, apparently added years later, that references the debate among scholars regarding whether the fleet sought refuge in Scotland, Portugal, or the Americas, which would be impressive, given that Columbus wouldn't officially discover them for another 185 years, though let's not get into pre-Columbian contact theories right now, because that's a whole different midnight rabbit hole. The stone floor beneath your feet is cold enough that you can feel it through your shoes, and you shift your weight, wondering if the Templar Knights who once walked these corridors, because yes, the Templars maintained diplomatic presence in Rome, though their relationship with the papacy was complicated in the way that all relationships involving massive amounts of money, political power, and competing visions of divine authority tend to be complicated, felt this same chill, this same sense of standing at the intersection of the known and the unknown, the documented and the deliberately obscured. There's something almost hypnotic about the way Brother Matteo reads the entries aloud, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, and you find yourself leaning closer, close enough to see that the ink has faded to a brown that's almost indistinguishable from the parchment itself, close enough to catch the faint smell of whatever herb, rosemary perhaps, or something more exotic from the spice roots that the Templars helped protect was used to keep insects away, though clearly it didn't work perfectly because there are tiny holes in some pages where enthusiastic medieval bookworms ate their way through accounts of treasure and treachery with equal appetite. The ledger mentions a Templar commander named Gerard de Villiers, who may or may not have existed depending on which historian you ask. And here we encounter one of those delightful scholarly debates where experts can't even agree on whether a person was real, which gives you some sense of how fragmentary our knowledge of this period truly is, and who allegedly received orders directly from Grand Master Jacques de Molay to prepare the fleet for departure, to gather the order's most valuable possessions, to ensure that whatever happened to the Templars in France, their legacy would survive somewhere beyond Philip's grasping fingers. You pause here, in this moment of quiet conspiracy, and reflect that the medieval world was basically one long game of chess, played with real kingdoms, real lives, and real treasure, except the rules kept changing depending on who could threaten whom with excommunication, or a convenient army, and the Templars, these men who'd taken vows of poverty while managing enough wealth to make them de facto international bankers, were caught in the middle, too powerful to ignore, too wealthy to leave alone, too well connected to easily destroy, which is probably why Philip had to resort to charges of heresy, idol worship, and various other accusations that ranged from plausible to utterly ridiculous, because simply saying "I want their money" lacked the theological gravitas necessary for a proper medieval power grab. Brother Matteo closes the ledger gently, as if tucking in a sleeping child, and you notice that the candlelight throws dancing shadows across the walls, creating the illusion of movement where there should be only stillness, and you think about those 18 ships slipping out of La Rochelle harbor under cover of darkness, their sails barely raised to avoid detection, the Templar Knights aboard them knowing they were leaving behind everything they'd built, churches, commanderies, networks of farms and vineyards, political alliances carefully cultivated over nearly 2 centuries for an uncertain future and an unknown destination, and you wonder what that must have felt like, that particular flavor of exile mixed with defiance, that sense of carrying something so valuable that its loss would be worse than death, that conviction that somewhere, somehow, the order would rise again, which of course it didn't, at least not in its original form, though conspiracy theorists have been trying to resurrect it in theory for centuries now. Bless their persistent hearts. The scene shifts now, and you're no longer in the Vatican's careful climate control, but standing instead on the docks of La Rochelle, as autumn wind cuts across the Atlantic, bringing with it the smell of salt and seaweed, and the particular kind of dampness that settles into your bones when you're on the French coast in October, which is to say a dampness that feels personally offended by the concept of dryness, and determined to make its point clear through your medieval woolen clothing that's already questionable in terms of both hygiene and thermal efficiency. The year is 1307, though you've somehow maintained your present tense consciousness, which is convenient for our narrative purposes, and also saves us from having to explain time travel mechanics to the Inquisition. And you're watching as crates are loaded onto a ship called according to a painted board that's probably going to be scrubbed off before departure, the Falcon of the Temple. Though whether that's the ship's real name or a temporary designation meant to be forgotten as quickly as possible, remains another one of those historical details that got lost somewhere between the 14th century and now, presumably along with several socks, and the truth about what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa. The Templar Knights moving the cargo work with practiced efficiency. These men who've spent years perfecting the art of looking simultaneously pious and dangerous, their white mantles, with the distinctive red cross marking them as members of an order that's about 36 hours away from being declared heretical across France, though they don't know the exact timing yet, only that something is wrong, that the political winds have shifted, that King Philip's debts to the temple have grown so enormous that the only way to escape them is to destroy the creditor, which is a bold financial strategy that would definitely violate modern banking regulations, but apparently passed for acceptable medieval economics. You notice the mainstream historical fact that La Rochelle was one of the Templars' principal Atlantic ports, a strategic location that gave them access to both Mediterranean trade routes via overland connections and the developing commerce with England and the northern kingdoms, making it an ideal launching point for a fleet that needed to disappear into the vastness of the ocean, where pursuing ships would have to know exactly where to look, and medieval navigation being what it was, essentially a combination of dead reckoning, prayer, and hoping you recognized the coastline when you finally saw land again. The chances of anyone finding these ships once they truly committed to vanishing were approximately the same as finding a specific grain of sand on a beach during a storm, while blindfolded and possibly drunk. The quirky historical tidbit here is that some Templar vessels were rumored to carry cats as both Mausers and good luck charms, with certain ships supposedly having specific felines whose lineage could be traced back to cats blessed by various saints, which is the kind of detail that sounds completely made up until you remember that medieval people took their animal superstitions very seriously, and that there are actual historical records of disputes over the ownership of particularly holy cats, making you wonder whether we've progressed as much as we like to think, or just transferred our obsessions to different subjects. The knight supervising the loading, his name you learn from eavesdropping, is Jean de Chalon, and you'd feel clever about the eavesdropping, except that he's basically shouting instructions in a voice trained to carry across battlefields, so really you're just standing there listening, like everyone else within 100 yards, pauses occasionally to scan the road leading into town, watching for the dust cloud that would signal approaching horsemen, the advance guard of Philip's arrests, the end of whatever window of opportunity they're currently exploiting. You can hear the creak of ropes, the shuffle of feet on wooden planks, the occasional muttered prayer in Latin. Because apparently, even when you're engaged in what's technically desertion and possibly theft, depending on your perspective about whether the Templars' wealth belonged to them or to the French crown, you still want to keep your spiritual bases covered, and honestly, who can blame them, given that medieval theology was quite clear about the eternal consequences of dying with unconfessed sins on your soul, making every potentially risky endeavor a careful calculation of earthly survival versus heavenly admission. The cargo itself is maddeningly non-specific. Wooden crates bound with iron straps, leather bags that clink with what might be coins or might be something else entirely, longer wrapped bundles that could contain anything from swords to sacred relics to someone's collection of particularly fine tablecloths. Because let's be honest, when you're fleeing for your life, you grab what seems valuable in the moment and sort it out later, and the knights loading them handle everything with a reverence that suggests they know exactly what they're carrying, even if they're not about to discuss it in front of the harbor workers who are being paid extra to forget they saw anything tonight, assuming they value their ability to continue seeing things in general. There's a scholarly debate referenced in the documents about whether the Templar fleet carried the Order's fabled treasure, which, depending on who's writing, might include anything from the Holy Grail to the Ark of the Covenant, to massive quantities of gold and silver, to important documents proving embarrassing facts about powerful people, to all of the above, plus a few items we haven't thought of yet. And the debate centers largely on whether the Templars even had time to gather such treasures given that the arrests happened rapidly, or whether they'd been quietly moving valuable items for weeks or months beforehand, having received warnings about Philip's intentions through the kind of informal intelligence networks that tend to develop when you're an international organization with members in every major European court. The ship rocks gently against the dock, and you feel that peculiar motion that water imparts to anything floating on it. That reminder that you're trusting your life to wooden planks and prayer, which honestly describes most of medieval transportation, and also explains why people didn't travel much, unless they absolutely had to, preferring to stay in one place where the ground remained reliably beneath them, and the worst that could happen was plague, famine, or invasion rather than drowning in the cold Atlantic while wearing approximately 40 pounds of wool that would helpfully ensure you sank efficiently. The other ships, you count them carefully, making it to 17 before losing track because they're loading simultaneously, and some are partially hidden by the harbor structures represent the Order's last mobile assets, their final chance to preserve something of what they've built over nearly 2 centuries of crusading, banking, and accumulating enough political influence to make kings nervous and popes thoughtful, which in retrospect was probably the core problem because making kings nervous is fine, as long as you're also making them dependent, but the moment they think they can survive without you, or worse, prosper from destroying you, your days are numbered, and your treasure fleet better be ready to sail on short notice. A bell tolls somewhere in the town. Not an alarm, just the regular marking of hours that medieval people used to structure their time, in the absence of smartphones and digital clocks, and that persistent anxiety about missing notifications, and you watch as the pace of loading increases, as if that bell reminded everyone involved that time is finite, and French soldiers are presumably not, that whatever they're going to save needs to be aboard and secured before dawn breaks and makes the fleet visible to anyone watching from the town walls. You notice details now that would have escaped your attention in daylight. The way certain crates are marked with symbols that aren't quite Templar crosses, but aren't quite anything else either, suggesting a coding system within a coding system. The way the knights speak to each other in low voices, that might be normal conversation or might be some form of cipher. The way they all keep their swords close despite being engaged in manual labor that would normally require setting them aside, as if they expect trouble and want to be ready to pivot from stevedore to soldier in the time it takes to draw a blade. The mainstream historical fact emerging here is that the Templar arrest orders were meant to be secret until the moment of execution, with Philip's seneschal distributing sealed instructions that weren't to be opened until the night of October 12th, but clearly someone talked, or someone guessed, or someone decided that keeping their Templar contacts alive was more valuable than keeping Philip's secrets, because these ships are here, loading, preparing to vanish, proving that medieval information security was about as reliable as, well, as anything else in a world where the most sophisticated encryption technology was speaking in Latin around people who only knew French, which worked great until everyone started learning Latin, at which point you had to switch to codes and hope the person intercepting your messages wasn't good at pattern recognition. The water slaps against the hull with a rhythm that's almost soothing, almost enough to make you forget that you're witnessing the collapse of one of medieval Europe's most powerful institutions, the transformation of warrior monks into fugitives, the beginning of a mystery that will puzzle historians for centuries and fuel countless conspiracy theories, ranging from the plausible to the utterly deranged, and you wonder what it says about human nature that we're more fascinated by the disappearance than we ever were by the presence, more interested in what the Templars became after they ceased to exist than in what they actually were when they were walking around being medieval knights with banking privileges. Jean de Chalon shouts an order, and the last crate swings aboard, secured by sailors who've probably transported everything from wine to wool to war supplies, but never quite cargo, this fraught with consequence, and you see the expressions on their faces, not quite fear, not quite excitement, something in between, that might best be described as the look of people who realize they're about to become a historical footnote, but aren't sure yet whether they'll be remembered as heroes, villains, or just another group who underestimated the vindictiveness of an indebted king. The sails begin to unfurl now, catching the night wind, and you're struck by how quiet it all is. No fanfare, no ceremony, no speeches about honor and duty, just the practical work of departure conducted with the urgency of people who know that sunrise will bring either freedom or capture, depending on how quickly they can get beyond the horizon. And there's something oddly modern about this moment, this realization that sometimes history's biggest turning points happen in silence, without dramatic music or voiceover narration, just people making hard choices with insufficient information and hoping it works out, which it sometimes does and sometimes doesn't, but either way, makes for interesting reading. 700 years later, when you're lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, and wondering whatever happened to those ships. You're at sea now. And the transition from dock to deck barely registered because apparently your subconscious decided that continuity of experience was less important than avoiding the awkward bit where people board ships while trying not to fall into the gap between vessel and pier, a gap that seems specifically designed to swallow dignity, and occasionally people who've miscalculated the jump. And honestly, that's fine because shipboarding scenes are overrated anyway, and we have bigger mysteries to unravel. specifically the mystery of where exactly 18 fully loaded Templar vessels went after leaving La Rochelle, a question that historians have been debating with varying degrees of evidence, speculation, and occasional outright fabrication for the better part of 7 centuries. The Atlantic at night is a special kind of darkness, the sort that makes you understand why ancient peoples populated the ocean with monsters, and why sailors developed elaborate superstitions about everything from whistling to women to albatrosses, because when you're surrounded by water that extends to the horizon in every direction, and the sky above is clouded enough to hide the stars you'd normally use for navigation, it becomes very clear very quickly that humans are not aquatic creatures, and that our presence on the ocean is a sustained act of optimism, bordering on delusion, supported mainly by wood, rope, and the hope that we've correctly remembered which direction land is located. The Falcon of the Temple. You're aboard it now, having made the metaphysical journey from observer to participant in the way that only sleep-deprived consciousness allows, rides the swells with a motion that's simultaneously soothing and nauseating, each rise and fall, a reminder that the ship is less a stable platform than a cork bobbing on forces far greater than itself, and you notice that the Templar Knights have divided themselves into 2 groups, those who are praying, and those who are actively trying not to vomit, with some ambitious individuals attempting both simultaneously in a display of multitasking that would be impressive if it weren't so obviously uncomfortable. The mainstream historical fact here is that medieval navigation relied heavily on portolan charts, detailed maps of coastlines and harbors that were accurate enough for coastal sailing, but became increasingly speculative once you left sight of land, meaning that any Templar fleet heading into the open Atlantic was essentially sailing on faith, dead reckoning, and the kind of optimism that characterizes people who've decided that drowning is preferable to arrest, which says something about their priorities, and also about King Philip's reputation for hospitality toward people he suspected of heresy. The quirky tidbit worth mentioning is that some Templar ships allegedly carried mirrors, said to have belonged to various Old Testament prophets, mirrors that supposedly showed not reflections but visions of the future, which is the kind of claim that makes you wonder whether someone spiked the medieval water supply with hallucinogens, or whether we've lost some important context about how metaphor worked in the 14th century, because surely no one actually believed in magic mirrors, except there are detailed inventories listing them alongside perfectly mundane items like cooking pots and spare rope, suggesting that either the Templars took their supernatural artifacts very seriously, or someone had an elaborate sense of humor about inventory management. The ship's commander, a grizzled knight named Robert de Sablé, not to be confused with the earlier Grand Master of the same name, because apparently medieval people believed in recycling names the way we believe in recycling plastic, which is to say enthusiastically but with mixed results, stands at the rail scanning the darkness behind them, looking for pursuing ships that may or may not exist but that everyone's nervous about anyway, because paranoia is just pattern recognition taken seriously, and in this case, the pattern strongly suggests that King Philip would really prefer to get his hands on whatever's in those crates currently secured in the hold. You move closer to the rail yourself, feeling the spray on your face, tasting salt, and you think about the scholarly debate regarding whether the Templar fleet headed north toward Scotland, where Robert the Bruce was conveniently fighting the English, and might welcome warrior monks with maritime experience and portable wealth, or south toward Portugal, where King Dinis had already shown himself sympathetic to the order, or even in the theories that make mainstream historians sigh heavily and reach for stronger coffee, west toward the Americas, which would require not only advanced navigational knowledge that we have no evidence the Templars possessed, but also a willingness to sail into the unknown that seems ambitious even for people fleeing arrest. The ocean sounds are hypnotic in their repetition. The slap of waves against the hull, the creak of timbers flexing with the ship's movement, the snap of canvas as wind fills the sails, the occasional cry of a seabird that's either following the ship or is very lost, and beneath it all, a kind of profound silence that makes you understand why sailors either become poets or stop talking altogether, because the sea demands responses that normal conversation can't provide, requiring instead either complete surrender to wonder or complete rejection of words in favor of simple presence. Another ship appears briefly in the darkness to starboard, one of the other fleet vessels, confirmed by a brief flash of signal lantern, using a code that's probably Templar-specific and definitely not recorded in any surviving documents, which is inconvenient for historians, but entirely reasonable from the perspective of people trying to maintain operational security while conducting what amounts to a medieval heist of their own treasury, and then it's gone again, swallowed by darkness and distance, a ghost among ghosts, a memory in the making. You descend to the hold where the cargo rests, secured against the ship's motion by ropes and wooden braces that would probably be inadequate in a real storm, but are hopefully sufficient for whatever weather they encounter tonight. And you notice that even here, below deck where the air is close and smells of tar and salt-preserved wood and unwashed knights who've been working hard under stress, there's a palpable sense of significance, as if the crates themselves radiate importance, though whether that's because they actually contain holy relics and vast treasure, or because everyone believes they do, which amounts to the same thing in terms of how carefully they're guarded, remains ambiguous. The mainstream historical fact emerging from the shadows is that several Portuguese noble families suddenly displayed significant wealth and Templar-associated symbols in the decades following 1307, suggesting at minimum that some of the order's assets found their way to Portugal, possibly carried by ships that look suspiciously like the vanished fleet, though proving causation 7 centuries after the fact is challenging. When the relevant parties had strong motivation to obscure their connections, and when medieval record-keeping was more general suggestion than comprehensive documentation, even under ideal circumstances. One of the knights sits beside a particularly large crate, his hand resting on it in a gesture that's either protective or possessive, or simply tired, because sitting down is underrated when you've been loading ships and preparing for exile, and contemplating the collapse of everything you've worked for, and he notices you watching, and offers a slight smile that contains more resignation than joy, the expression of someone who's made peace with uncertainty, who's accepted that tomorrow is a mystery, and the day after that even more so, but who's chosen to keep moving forward anyway because the alternative is surrender, and Templars, whatever their faults, were not particularly known for surrendering easily. You ask him in whatever language dreams use when they want to avoid linguistic complications, what's in the crate, and he laughs, actually laughs, a sound that's surprising in its genuine amusement, and says that he doesn't know, that he was told to load it, guard it, and deliver it safely to wherever they eventually make landfall, but that the contents are above his pay grade, which is a phrase he doesn't use because it won't be invented for several centuries, but the concept is clearly there, the recognition that some information is compartmentalized, that the order structure ensured that not everyone knew everything, that secrets within secrets was standard operating procedure for an organization that had learned to navigate papal politics, crusader logistics, and international banking simultaneously. The ship shudders as it catches a larger wave, and you feel the timber flex beneath you, a reminder that you're trusting your life to materials that were alive until recently, cut from forests and shaped by human hands into something that can resist the ocean's pressure, but only temporarily, only as long as the construction holds and the storm isn't too severe, and the crew knows what they're doing, and luck favors the well-prepared, which it sometimes does, and sometimes doesn't. But you can't exactly pull over and call for roadside assistance when you're in the middle of the Atlantic at night, fleeing from a king who wants you dead, and possibly Satan-worshipping, depending on which propaganda you believe. The scholarly debate surfaces again, as you overhear 2 knights discussing navigation, one insisting they should head north using the stars when the clouds clear, the other arguing for a southern route along the coast where they can at least see land and know where they are, and their debate mirrors the historical uncertainty about the fleet's destination, that fundamental gap in our knowledge about where these ships went, whether they stayed together or split up, whether they all reached safety, or some were lost to storms, pirates, or pursuit, whether the crates in the hold were delivered to their intended destination, or ended up scattered across multiple locations, or sank to the ocean floor where they remain, theoretically, waiting for some future archaeologist with really excellent underwater equipment and a lot of time on their hands. You notice the way the lamplight plays across the curved hull, creating patterns that shift with the ship's movement, and you think about how these knights have traded the certainty of their commanderies, the stone buildings, the regulated prayers, the known routines for this wooden uncertainty, this floating possibility, this commitment to an unknown future that might include building a new order somewhere else, or might include drowning anonymously in waters that won't be accurately mapped for another 400 years, and you wonder what that does to a person's psychology, that level of upheaval, that complete inversion of stability, that transformation from secure institution to desperate fugitives in the span of a single night. Dawn approaches, and you're standing now on Portuguese shore, specifically the coast near where the city of Tomar will one day host the Convento de Cristo, though right now it's just rocky coastline with pine forests rising inland, and the Atlantic behind you looking deceptively calm in the early light, the kind of calm that makes you forget it tried to kill you multiple times during the night. But that's water's specialty, amnesia-inducing beauty, alternating with murderous waves, and you're watching as the first of the Templar ships drops anchor in a sheltered bay, its sails furled, its crew exhausted but alive, having successfully navigated from La Rochelle to Portugal, which doesn't sound impressive in our age of GPS and weather satellites, but which in 1307 required skill, luck, and faith in roughly equal measure, plus the kind of sailors who could look at clouds and water and somehow deduce both direction and destination from patterns that appear completely random to anyone not trained in the art. The mainstream historical fact here is unambiguous. King Dinas of Portugal refused to suppress the Templars, instead allowing the order to reorganize under a new name, the Order of Christ, maintaining their properties, privileges, and essential function, while sidestepping the political controversy of defending an organization that the Pope, under pressure from Philip of France, had officially dissolved, which is exactly the kind of clever bureaucratic maneuver that makes you appreciate medieval statecraft, because Dinas essentially kept the Templars while claiming he'd followed papal orders, satisfying everyone through the simple expedient of changing the letterhead, and hoping nobody looked too closely at whether the knights in Portuguese commanderies were actually new recruits or just the same Templars wearing slightly different crosses. The quirky historical tidbit worth savoring is that the Order of Christ later funded Portuguese exploration, including Vasco da Gama's voyage to India, meaning that in a roundabout way, the Templar treasure that vanished from La Rochelle may have ultimately funded the Age of Discovery, which is either poetic justice or historical irony or both, depending on how you feel about warrior monks inadvertently launching global colonialism by trying to avoid arrest, and there's probably a lesson in there about unintended consequences and the long-term effects of midnight fleet departures, though what exactly that lesson is remains, like so much else about the Templars, subject to interpretation. You walk along the beach, your feet leaving impressions in sand that the next tide will erase, which feels appropriately metaphorical, given that you're contemplating a historical episode whose traces have been systematically erased, obscured, or rewritten by everyone involved, because the Portuguese didn't want to advertise their protection of technically heretical knights. The surviving Templars didn't want to draw attention to their new identities, and everyone else was busy dealing with the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and various other medieval disasters that made the question of what happened to some ships and treasure seem relatively unimportant, at least until modern historians decided it was a fascinating mystery worth endless speculation. The crates are being unloaded now, carried up the beach by knights who look simultaneously relieved and uncertain, because they've achieved the immediate goal of escape, but the long-term question of what comes next remains unanswered, though you notice that Portuguese officials are present discreetly, because apparently even when you're openly protecting banned knights, you maintain some plausible deniability, and seem to be directing the cargo toward wagons that will presumably transport it inland to locations that won't appear in any official records, because record-keeping is optional when you're technically doing something that could get you excommunicated if the Pope were paying closer attention. The scholarly debate here centers on whether all 18 ships made it to Portugal, or whether some continued to other destinations, or whether losses to storm and navigation errors reduced the fleet before it reached any safe harbor, and this debate will never be fully resolved, because the Templars had excellent reasons to obscure their movements, and the Portuguese had excellent reasons to obscure their assistance, and the French had excellent reasons to claim they'd successfully destroyed the order, leaving us with contradictory sources, suspicious gaps in documentation, and the kind of historical ambiguity that makes for great bedtime stories, but frustrating doctoral dissertations. You notice that one of the knights, you recognize Jean de Chalon from La Rochelle, confirming at least his fictional survival in our narrative, is supervising the unloading with the same careful attention he showed during loading, and you wonder what's going through his mind, whether he feels triumph at successful escape, grief at what's been lost, anxiety about the future, or just overwhelming fatigue because medieval ocean voyages were exhausting even when you weren't fleeing royal persecution, combining sleep deprivation, constant dampness, questionable food, and the persistent awareness that you were one storm away from death, in a way that really puts modern travel complaints about airline legroom into perspective. The sun rises properly now, burning off the morning mist, revealing the Portuguese coast in detail, the cliffs, the vegetation, the suggestions of settlements inland, and you think about how this moment represents both ending and beginning, the conclusion of the Templars as an independent military order, and the start of their transformation into something else, something that would persist through the Order of Christ, and through various other successor organizations, and through the countless conspiracy theories that would claim unbroken continuity from 1307 to the present, though most serious historians view such claims with the same skepticism they apply to stories about magical mirrors and weeping crosses, which is to say polite interest combined with gentle reminders about the importance of documentary evidence. The mainstream historical fact that bears repeating is that the Knights Templar were officially dissolved by Pope Clement V in 1312 at the Council of Vienne, their properties transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, except in Portugal, where King Dinis successfully argued for local control, creating the administrative fiction that allowed the order to continue under new management. And while this isn't as dramatic as stories about treasure maps and secret voyages to America, it represents the actual documented mechanism by which Templar assets and personnel were preserved, proving that sometimes the conspiracy is just careful bureaucracy, and that sometimes the real mystery is how people convinced themselves that anything more complicated was necessary. You watch as the last crate comes ashore, and you notice it's marked with a symbol you haven't seen before, not a Templar cross, not a Portuguese royal seal, but something else, something that might be a letter in an alphabet you don't recognize, or might be a number in a counting system that didn't survive, or might be just a scratch from rough handling during transport. And this ambiguity feels appropriate, feels like the perfect summary of everything the Templars represent. Evidence that suggests significance but doesn't confirm it, traces that imply stories but don't tell them, remains that pose questions but don't answer them. The Knights begin moving inland, and you follow, because why not? Because you've come this far, and you're not going to stop now, and you notice that they're already removing their distinctive white mantles, already adopting the appearance of ordinary travelers, already implementing the kind of operational security that will make historians 7 centuries later tear their hair out trying to figure out what happened. And you have to respect the thoroughness even as you lament the loss of clarity, because they understood something important, that survival sometimes requires becoming invisible, that preservation sometimes demands transformation, that the best way to keep a secret is to make people forget there's something worth looking for. The Portuguese officials lead the group toward a monastery complex that rises among the trees, stone buildings that will eventually become part of the Templar Order of Christ legacy, but which right now are just shelter, safety, a place to rest, after weeks of tension and nights of sailing, and the profound exhaustion that comes from successfully escaping one life without yet knowing what the next one holds. And as you watch them disappear into the buildings, you realize that this is where the story becomes fragments, where the clear narrative dissolves into possibilities, where history gives way to mystery, and documentation yields to speculation. And maybe that's appropriate, maybe that's exactly how it should be, because some endings are actually transformations, and some disappearances are just changes of address, and some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, not because the truth isn't out there somewhere, possibly in Portuguese archives or underwater, or just lost to time's inevitable erosion, but because the question has become more interesting than any answer could be, more productive of thought and wonder, and midnight fascination, than any definitive conclusion about exactly which crate contained what, and where it ended up, and whether the Templars really did help fund the Age of Discovery, or just got lucky with real estate in Portugal. And as the sun climbs higher, and the scene begins to fade, you understand that you've witnessed not a solution, but a transformation, not an ending but a continuation under different names, not a disappearance but a deliberate obscuring, which is, in its own way, more satisfying than any neat resolution could have been. So here we are, having followed the Templars from Vatican archives through October darkness at La Rochelle, across the Atlantic's medieval vastness, to Portugal's accommodating shores. And what have we learned, except that history is less about answers than about increasingly sophisticated questions, less about certainty than about the comfortable admission that some things remain unknowable, despite our best archaeological efforts and most creative interpretations of fragmentary evidence. The Knights Templar disappeared on October 13, 1307, or rather they didn't disappear so much as they were forcibly transformed, arrested in France, allowed to reorganize in Portugal, scattered to Scotland and other sympathetic territories, their institution dismantled, but their influence persisting through successor orders, through architectural legacies, through financial innovations that became standard banking practice, through the simple fact that 2 centuries of accumulated power and knowledge doesn't just vanish even when the organization carrying it is officially dissolved by papal decree. The historical significance of that night when the fleet departed La Rochelle lies not in any treasure they carried, though the treasure makes for better stories and more engaging speculation, but in what it represents about medieval power structures, about the relationship between church and state, about how institutions protect themselves when political protection evaporates, about the fact that King Philip's debts to the Templars were so enormous that destroying the organization seemed more practical than paying them back, which tells you something about both medieval finance and the creative problem-solving capabilities of desperate monarchs who really should have just declared bankruptcy like normal people, except that banking hadn't quite developed, so instead, you got heresy trials and arrests, and fleets departing in darkness, carrying whatever could be saved. The scholarly debates that swirl around the Templars, about their beliefs, their treasure, their ultimate destination, their continuation through secret societies, or their complete dissolution, reflect our discomfort with ambiguity, our desire for clear narratives in a medieval world that specialized in obscurity, our need to believe that important events have equally important consequences rather than just kind of trailing off into administrative reorganization and changed letterhead. You think back to Brother Matteo in the Vatican archives, his hands shaking as he held documents that proved some things while suggesting others, and you understand now that those tremors weren't just age or caffeine, but the physical manifestation of holding contradictory truths. Yes, the Templars were arrested. Yes, some escaped. Yes, they carried valuable cargo. Yes, we don't know exactly what or where it ended up. Yes, they reformed in Portugal. Yes, this isn't as dramatic as conspiracy theories suggest. Yes, it's more interesting than simple dissolution would have been. The sensory memories layer themselves now. The smell of old parchment yielding to salt air, the cold stone floor of Roman vaults giving way to the rolling deck of ships, the quiet of archives contrasting with ocean sounds, the darkness of medieval night punctuated by signal lanterns, the taste of salt spray, the feel of sand beneath feet, the sight of morning light revealing Portuguese cliffs, and these physical details matter, because history isn't just dates and documents, but the lived experience of people making desperate choices with incomplete information, people who felt fear and hope and exhaustion, people who probably wondered whether they were doing the right thing or just postponing the inevitable, people remarkably like us, except for their casual acceptance of parasites and their complete lack of central heating. The mystery of the Templar fleet persists not because evidence doesn't exist, but because the evidence we have is deliberately obscured, carefully scattered, intentionally ambiguous, the product of multiple parties with strong incentives to hide, forget, or rewrite what actually happened. And this itself is significant because it shows how power operates, how organizations protect themselves, how survival sometimes requires becoming invisible, how the most successful escapes are the ones nobody notices until it's too late to follow. The legacy they left is paradoxical, an order that failed to survive, but whose influence persists, a treasure that disappeared, but whose economic impact might have funded exploration, a story that ended but continues generating questions, a mystery that's been solved. They went to Portugal, but remains mysterious. But what exactly did they bring, and where did it all end up? And did some ships go elsewhere? And what about the charges against them? And were they really heretics or just wealthy enough to attract royal attention? You picture those 18 ships one more time, sails catching wind, disappearing into darkness, carrying men who'd sworn vows to protect pilgrims and ended up protecting themselves, carrying cargo that might have been sacred, or might have been simply valuable, or might have been both, carrying a legacy that would outlive the organization that created it. And you understand that this image, this moment of departure, this transformation of warrior monks into fugitives, this leap from certainty into unknown waters, represents something essential about how change happens, how institutions adapt or die, how power shifts from those who claim it openly to those who exercise it quietly, how sometimes the most important historical events are the ones that get deliberately erased from official records but persist in margins, legends, and the kind of speculation that fills bedtime history videos for people who can't sleep and want to think about medieval mysteries instead of modern anxieties. And now, as our journey through Templar mysteries draws to a close, and the night deepens around you wherever you are in the world, whether you're in Istanbul where it's early morning, or somewhere across the Atlantic where midnight approaches, or in between where time zones blur and the arbitrary division of hours seems particularly meaningless, it's time to let these images settle, to allow the weight of 7 centuries to compress into the gentle pressure of eyelids growing heavy, to transform historical inquiry into the soft material of dreams where Templar ships can sail through your unconscious, their destinations uncertain, their cargo symbolic of whatever treasures you're protecting in your own life, whatever you'd load onto ships if you needed to escape some approaching danger, whatever you'd consider valuable enough to preserve at the cost of everything familiar. Close your eyes and picture that Vatican archive one more time, the candlelight dancing across ancient parchment, Brother Matteo's careful hands replacing documents into chests that will remain locked for another generation, or century, or until the next insomniac historian, with proper credentials and good connections, decides to investigate what really happened that October night in 1307, and feel yourself sinking into the comfortable darkness of the archive, where every shelf holds stories, where every document whispers secrets, where the very dust is historically significant, and you can rest among these accumulated centuries without obligation to solve their mysteries, without pressure to choose between competing theories, without need to determine which scholarly debate you find most convincing. Let your breath slow to match the rhythm of waves against the falcon of the temple's hull, that gentle rise and fall that carried knights across the Atlantic, that motion which is simultaneously soothing and unsettling, both lullaby and warning, and allow yourself to drift on these same currents, feeling the deck beneath you solid enough to trust, but flexible enough to survive the ocean's pressure, knowing that you're supported by structures built by people who understood both engineering and faith, who combined practical carpentry with spiritual conviction, who created vessels that could transport not just physical cargo, but hope, possibility, the idea that somewhere beyond the horizon lay safety, even when every map said otherwise. If you've enjoyed this journey through medieval mysteries and maritime disappearances, through conspiracy and fact and the comfortable space between them, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel, press that like button if it feels right, share this video with fellow insomniacs and history enthusiasts, and people who appreciate the way candlelight looks on 700-year-old paper, because creating these bedtime histories is my way of transforming research into rest, of turning historical fascination into sleep facilitation, of making the past serve the present, by helping you disconnect from whatever's keeping you awake, deadlines, decisions, the persistent modern anxiety that accompanies being alive in times that are simultaneously too fast and too slow, and reconnect with the simple animal need for rest that humans have experienced since long before there were Templars to arrest or fleets to lose. Picture now the Portuguese shore at dawn, sand beneath your feet, the gentle sound of waves erasing footprints, the smell of pine trees and salt air mixing into something that exists only in that specific location at that specific moment, and understand that you can return here whenever you need to, that this beach exists outside time as a place of arrival, safety, transformation, where you can stand and watch ships anchor and cargo unload, and knights remove their distinctive white mantles, becoming anonymous, becoming invisible, becoming safe through the simple expedient of changing appearance while maintaining essence, which is perhaps what sleep does for us, allowing us to remain ourselves while temporarily becoming unconscious, preserving identity while surrendering awareness, maintaining continuity while experiencing discontinuity, which is a mystery as profound as any Templar disappearance and considerably more personally relevant to your immediate needs. The monastery bells are ringing somewhere inland, calling monks to prayer, or marking hours, or just existing as bronze sound in morning air, and you can hear them even as they fade, even as the scene dissolves, even as Portugal in 1307 yields to your bedroom in 2024, because some sounds persist across centuries, some rhythms continue regardless of what empires rise or fall, or which orders get arrested, or which fleets vanish, and those persistent rhythms, waves, bells, breath, heartbeat, are what carry us through darkness into light, through waking into sleep, through historical investigation into historical rest. Let the Templar treasure sink now into the deep unconscious where all valuables are ultimately stored, where the things you need to remember settle beneath the surface of immediate thought, preserved but not pressuring, accessible but not anxious, guarded by knights who've learned that sometimes protection means letting go, that sometimes the best way to keep something safe is to stop checking whether it's still there, to trust that what matters will persist while what doesn't will naturally fade. And you can trust this same process with your own thoughts, allowing the important ones to settle, while the anxious ones dissolve, permitting your mind to organize itself the way those crates were organized in the ship's hold, each in its proper place, each secured against the journey's turbulence, each exactly where it needs to be, without requiring your conscious supervision. The moon rises over the Atlantic, or maybe it's setting. Time becomes flexible in this space between wake and sleep, in this gentle transition where historical narratives become dream material, where Templar ships transform into symbols, where the question of what happened 700 years ago matters less than the feeling of having investigated something together, of having shared this journey through archives and oceans and mysteries that remain mysterious, not despite our investigation, but because of their essential nature as events that people deliberately obscured, thoughtfully complicated, carefully erased from official memory, while preserving in unofficial tradition, in legend, in the stories we tell when we can't sleep and want to think about something vast enough to make our personal concerns seem appropriately small. So sleep now, knowing that the Templars found safety even if we can't trace their exact path, that treasure was preserved even if we don't know its precise location, that institutional memory persists even when institutions dissolve, that some questions are more valuable unanswered, that mystery serves purposes that solution would eliminate, that not knowing exactly what happened doesn't mean nothing happened, just that what happened transformed itself into story, legend, speculation, the kind of historical material that soothes rather than stimulates, that invites rest rather than research, that says you've done enough thinking for tonight, and tomorrow will still be there with its own questions, its own mysteries, its own ships departing into darkness, carrying whatever you need them to carry toward destinations that remain, for now, blessedly unknown, and therefore unlimited in their possibility. End of script. Sweet dreams.